I've got to tell you, the temptation is there. The temptation, that is, to make Jesus' parable about the 10 bridesmaids, about us versus them, the wise versus the foolish, the right versus the wrong. I mean, after yesterday's election outcome was announced, the temptation was there to use this parable as proof to justify the true wise ones of this country. See? The wise ones get into the party. The wise ones get to make the victory speech. The wise ones win the presidency. Not having a plan for the moment you run out of your oil in your lamps, or for how you'll deal with the problems of this world, means that you will get shut out. Yes, I admit the temptation was there. But, oh, dear friends, there's a lot of that already happening in this world today without really needing the help of this parable. Plus, to use this parable in a way that accentuates this divide in our country would not be faithful. Jesus was not talking about 21st century American politics here. But he was talking. And usually when Jesus talks, we should listen. And what we expect to hear from Jesus when he does talk is a word of hope. I had a professor in seminary who said that it's the preacher's job to squeeze the biblical text until the gospel starts dripping out. Well, that's what I've done this week, friends, and I hope you are ready for some good news. So, putting politics aside for at least the next 10 minutes, what is the faithful way to interpret this parable? Well, there may not be one faithful way here. The beauty of the parables is that there are multiple, and I would agree, multiple faithful ways to interpret them. It's almost always, for example, to take a parable and to spin it around on its axis. Or I usually think of the parables as these mixed bags of characters. You can throw them up in the air and wait to see where they land, and then wonder if somehow this game of musical chairs sheds light on what Jesus might be trying to say. It's also almost always faithful to ask questions of the text, or to read between the lines, or to imagine who else might be in the story but is never actually mentioned. The question about this parable, this particular parable that haunted me this week, was this: what would have happened had those 5 foolish bridesmaids not left the scene? Spoiler alert, I think they'd have gotten into the party. We have no indication, contrary to our gut reactions to the parable, that admission to the party is about having enough oil. After all, the command at the end of the parable is to keep awake, not make sure you have enough oil. But admission to the party is also not really dependent on staying awake. After all the bridesmaids fall asleep. It's only because someone has woken them up that the wise bridesmaids don't miss it. So if it's not about oil, and if it's not about staying awake, then what is it about? Well, I'd like to suggest that it's about presence, and that it's about community. Now, I've got to tell you, I'm glad it's not about staying awake. You see, I really like my sleep. I like it so much that I was the kid who went to a slumber party and actually slept. I was the kid who, on the first night of sleepaway camp, would ask a friend to look after me after I fell asleep, just to make sure that nobody put toothpaste on my sleeping bag. Even at 10 years old, I knew myself well enough to know that I was much happier during the day if I slept well at night. But that did make me a pretty boring slumber party guest and cabin mate. There was one particular slumber party I went to where, as was typical for me, I fell asleep before everybody else, except that I wasn't all the way asleep when I heard one of the other girls ask the host, why she had invited me to the party. The assumption was that you wouldn't invite someone to the party who would simply go to sleep so early. And I will never forget what that host said. My friend, without missing a beat, simply said, "She's my friend, and I wanted her here." It's ironic when you consider our parable, but that friend ended up being a bridesmaid at my own wedding. It's not about staying awake. It's not about having enough oil. It's about simply staying and being there. And with a host like that, your presence, our presence, is enough. When Matthew wrote his gospel, his community was trying to make sense of what's called in religious speak the delayed parousia, the fact that Jesus' second coming did not happen as quickly as they thought it would. Imagine if they knew that 2,000 years later, they'd still be waiting. I don't think we give Jesus' second coming much thought anymore. At least I don't. I do believe it will happen one day, but I'm not standing at the window waiting for Jesus' heavenly chariot to pull in my driveway the way I remember waiting in anticipation for my grandparents to arrive for a visit when I was little. I'm not looking for signs of the end of the world or trying to interpret the events of this world as signs of the end. But where community happens, where we learn to be with one another and to remain with one another, I do see Jesus come. I see Jesus show up. Time and time again, the bridegroom does show up. We're only foolish if we leave the community, if we leave one another. Let me tell you how I've seen this happen recently. Since March 15th, we've been logging onto Zoom every week for worship. It's not perfect, but as Stephanie reminded us a few weeks ago in her temple talk, it has provided us with support and connection in the midst of some of the greatest isolation some of us have ever experienced. Back in September, 15 people gathered to paint the church building. And a few weeks later, another crowd of people gathered at now Pastor Betsy's house to get it ready to sell so that she could move closer to her work and to her kids' school. I've recently been on the phone with a pastor we met from Costa Rica who was concerned about her sick dog. She had remembered that Frank, who went with us to Costa Rica last summer, was a vet. And Frank got on the phone with her and helped her as best as he could from 1,800 miles away. One of you called recently to ask if they had experienced recent flooding in Costa Rica from the storms in Central America. I have reached out and am waiting to hear, but you have shown your care. Sally calculates that she delivered close to 1,000 sandwiches to Roof Above since the pandemic started that she collected from your homes. Someone else reached out to me recently in need of a truck to help move. I called Laura and Kathy, whom I knew had a truck, and they helped them move. Someone else called me to ask for suggestions for what we might pray for during this time in our country and our world. In each one of these situations, Jesus shows up. The bridegroom comes to the party. Each one of these situations represents a foretaste of that feast to come, that day when Jesus will come again at the end of the age. I think Jesus comes in other ways too, of course, certainly in nature and in silence and in solitude. But I also think there's a reason so many of our biblical images of God's kingdom are those of parties and banquets. God uses community to reveal God's self. Is it a perfect community? No, heavens no. Do I wish those so-called wise bridesmaids would have shared their oil with the ones who ran out? Yes, definitely. Do I also think, though, that maybe they had a change of heart once they'd realized that this party was a little different from other weddings that they'd been to? Yeah. Do I also think that however much oil they had in their lamps, that it wasn't as important as they initially thought it would be? Yeah, I do. No, we are not a perfect community. But if we gather in the name of Jesus, which we do, and if we allow this particular gathering to shape who we are, that I believe with my whole heart that we will all be at the party. Yes, at the end of the age, but also today, as it happens in our very midst, as our light is given and received with one another in our midst. Oil is one thing, friends, but light is something else. Oil can be hoarded, but light is always shared. A light in the darkness